So I showed you before some ideas about looking around your house for interesting objects to photograph, and it works outside too, obviously. The same kind of principles apply. What we're looking for is just interesting shapes, interesting compositions. So I noticed this hose that has been lying here, obviously, for some amount of time, um, and that makes some interesting ideas to photograph. I'm just going to take a bunch of pictures to begin with because I will later on do some editing. Now I'm noticing actually there was something sitting there on the pavement. It's not there anymore, but it left a ring, and that's kind of an interesting combination with the circular quality of the hose and then that circle too. Another thing that's great to look for outside is textures, interesting patterns. So over here, where there are some new flowers coming up, what's really interesting to me is this tangle of weeds and leaves and things like that. So I'm going to take a bunch of pictures just of anything that looks interesting to me, because I know when I get back inside and can start editing, I can do a lot with that. I might get something over here because there's a nice contrast. Remember, contrast is the difference between two things. Between these new flowers that are coming up and the dried old dead leaves around them. So I'm just looking for some interesting angles to get pictures from. Sometimes maybe I'll just get a picture directly above it. That might be interesting. Or sometimes I'll try to get below the flower a little bit. Just looking at different ways to look at things, because that's really what art is all about. Mostly it's different ways to look at things. Like if I look at this fence, the fence obviously, but there's some interesting, depending on what angle I look at it from, I'm seeing interesting things. Like I can see what's on the other side of the fence, or these slats here start to create interesting patterns. So back inside now, looking at a bunch of the pictures I took, I'm going to take some and work on them a little bit with some editing. We've went over in a previous video about how to use the editing tools. You've got the cropping tool, and I'm going to crop this a little bit because I can see my foot in it. I don't want my foot in the picture there. I'm going to make it a little bit more, so the only thing in this picture is this sort of interesting shape of the hose. Now, the 3 dots gives me a bunch of different choices here. And I scroll through them, I just sort of look at it, see what I like. I tend to like using the black and white images just because that to me is it looks very different. I'm going to use this one, Silvertone. Silvertone is a filter that is supposed to mimic early photographs. Silver nitrate was the primary ingredient. That's why it's called Silvertone. I'm going to change the contrast a bit because that might be so interesting. Okay, see, when I make the contrast really intense, to me, then it starts to have a different look to it altogether. Oh, I like that. So I might just go with that as an image. That to me looks interesting. It shows the contrast, shows up the different the textures created by the leaves there. So if I go back to another one of my pictures, maybe one of my pictures of the flowers and the, yeah. What I might do with this one again is crop it, make it so it's pretty much just, I'm just seeing these colors together. And then I'm going to try something a little different here. I'm going to go to the saturation control and make it really intense. 100% saturation. It just boosts the colors incredibly. Now, let's take a look at what I get. Oh, now I'm starting to get some really wild effects. Oh, that's kind of nice too. Very blue tone. I like that actually. That's dramatic warm, isn't it? Now I'm going to go back And I may change some things with the brightness. Might do some stuff with that, or the contrast. Temperature is, or warmth is a control on here. Basically makes things either more blue or more brown. So I might do something like that. Yeah, I like that. So as we talked about before, with just the controls that are on your typical iPhone or iPad, and probably pretty much any cell phone camera, you can do quite a lot to change the picture and make it a lot more interesting. Make it almost perhaps some sort of a fantasy kind of scene or something like that. So there's some ideas. Looking for interesting textures, interesting shapes outside. You could do that while you're on a walk, which would be great. Getting a little bit of exercise, and just have a cell phone handy to get some pictures of interesting things that you see. Take a bunch of them, bring it back, and then work on them later on. And I think you'll come up with some neat stuff. I would love to see what you come up with.